our first Fox News Sunday sit-down, South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Mayor, welcome to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you. Good morning.
So, there are now more, and today Kirsten Gillibrand officially entered the race. There are now more than a dozen candidates officially in the race. You're the only one who still has an exploratory committee. What are you exploring, and when are you going to decide whether to get it?
So we put together the exploratory committee and rolled it out in January to see what the response would be to the idea of a Midwestern millennial mayor entering the conversation for president. Would anybody take note? How would the fundraising go? Would there be a level of interest in the early states? Now we're seeing all of those things, but because I'm not highly famous and I'm not personally wealthy, it takes a little bit to get the organization in place for a launch. You only get to launch once. And I got to tell you, I'm not going to make any news this morning, but all of the signs are pointing in the right direction. And when we do come out, it's going to be a big one.
People are trying to make sense of this huge sprawling field, young versus old, further left versus more moderate. What's your line?
I don't know. I think everybody wants to fit you on an ideological spectrum, which I think has never been less relevant. I think more and more people just want to know what your ideas are and whether they make any sense. And part of how we were able to succeed in South Bend, governing, I believe, in accordance with progressive values, but also earning a lot of support from Republicans and independents, wasn't by trying to manage exactly where I was on this kind of left-right spectrum. It was by trying to do the right thing. I view myself as a progressive, but these labels are becoming less and less useful.
We're going to get into specific issues in a moment. One more sort of political question. One of the ways in which you stand out is that you're 37, and if elected, you would be the youngest president ever. To some degree, people talk about you as the bright, shiny thing in the field. The question is, now that Beto O'Rourke is in it, some people in the grassroots say he's the brighter, shinier thing. How do you combat Beto, and like him, were you born to be in this race?
I think I was born to make myself useful, and I'm not combating anybody. There are going to be competitors more than opponents, I think, among the Democrats, and that's a good thing. But I do believe that I'm not like the others. I belong to a different generation than most of the others. Mine was the generation that was in high school when school shootings started to be the norm, or the generation that's going to be on the business end of the consequences of climate change. We're also the generation that's on track to be the first in American history to make less than our parents if nothing is done to change the trajectory of our economy. I think having a voice from that generation, having a voice with executive leadership, and I got to tell you, I know I'm the young face in this conversation, but not only do I have more years of government experience under my belt than the president, but I've got more years of executive government experience under my belt than the vice president. I think that's relevant. And I think coming from the industrial Midwest, a place where, unfortunately, my party really lost touch with a lot of voters, especially in 2016. It's a combination of attributes, not to mention the military service that I bring to the table, that is simply different from the others, and I'm looking forward to competing.
Let's do a lightning round. Quick questions, quick answers. To the degree that you think you have one, what's your big idea? What's your core message?
Well, the biggest idea is about
lightning round. You got to be quick.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'd say generational change, and then liberty, democracy. Not only when you unpack each of
For Lenny.
They point you in a specific direction with some policy.
He's gay?
Maybe the rest of the lightning round will help us get
Let's turn to what some of the other Democrats are talking about. What's on the ideological agenda right now. A lot of Democrats pushing the Green New Deal. You have said that it's more of a goal than a plan. Explain.
That's right. I mean, it's a handful of pages laying out a goal for us to cut carbon emissions before they lead to changes that really destroy our economy and any prospect for people in my generation to do well. I'm thinking about what the world's going to look like in 2054 when I get to the current age of the current president. And if we don't act aggressively and immediately on climate, it's not going to be a pretty picture. So,
but are you saying, for instance, that some of the talk about retrofitting every building in America or trying to make the country carbon free by 2030, that that's just unrealistic?
We're going to have to do it. Look,
by 2030?
If we can't do carbon free, then we'll do net carbon free, which means that we're taking out as much as we're putting in. The bottom line is, scientifically, the right year to do that was yesterday. We have got to do this. This timetable isn't being set in Congress. It's being set by reality. It's being set by science, and it's going to hit. Those deadlines are going to hit in our climate with or without us, and so we have to act. What the Green New Deal gets right is it recognizes there's also a lot of economic opportunity in this. Retrofitting buildings means a huge amount of jobs for the building trades in this country. I view that as a good thing.
Okay, we're way over the lightning round. Medicare for all. You say it should be Medicare for all who want it.
That's right. Well, I do believe that a single-payer environment is probably the right answer in the long term. But I think any politician who throws around phrases like Medicare for all has a responsibility to explain how we would get there. In my view, what you want to do is you take something like Medicare, you put it on the exchanges as a kind of public option, and if people like me are right that that is both good coverage and more cost efficient, then more and more people will buy in, and it'll be a very natural glide path toward a single-payer environment.
Was Kamala Harris wrong when she talked about just eliminating private insurance?
Yeah, I do it differently. I mean, think about Medicare itself. You still have Medicare Advantage and plans around that. Even countries like the UK with nationalized medicine still have a role for the private sector. So I think there will be a role for the private sector, but a very different one than we have in the corporate system today.
The Supreme Court, you talk about possibly expanding the court from 9 justices to 15.
Yeah, but it's not just about throwing more justices on the court. What I think we need to do is some kind of structural reform that makes the court less political. We can't go on like this where every time there's a vacancy, there's this apocalyptic ideological battle. So one idea that I think is interesting is you have 15 members, but only 10 of them are appointed in the political fashion. 5 of them can only be seated by unanimous agreement of the other 10. There are other ideas that have been floated too about term limits or about rotating justices up from the appellate bench. I think we should have a national debate about what's appropriate, especially within the framework of the Constitution. But the bottom line is we've got to make some kind of structural reform to depoliticize the Supreme Court.
After Donald Trump's victory in 2016, you wrote an essay in which you said that, I think it was called something from Flyover Country, was that correct? What you said, Democrats have largely, and to their very much their laws, their cause, have ignored the industrial Midwest. How would you take on Donald Trump, and specifically, how do you beat him in Michigan and Ohio and Wisconsin, that upper Rust Belt that he took away from the Democrats?
Well, again, coming from a former auto manufacturing town in the northern part of Indiana, this is my home, and I understand why our party largely lost touch. But I don't think it's just about Donald Trump. As a matter of fact, I think in many ways he's a symptom rather than a cause. Where I come from, there are a lot of people, and I think there are a lot of viewers of this network who are under no illusions about the character of the president, but voted this way in order to make a statement. Some people, I think, voted to burn the house down because they'd seen how, for years, Democratic and Republican presidencies produce economic and social and political results that let them down. We've got to be speaking to people.
Okay, I mean, forgive me, that seems a little gauzy. So how do you say to the people in those states, that feel that they've been left behind by globalism, things like that, globalization? I got a better answer than Donald Trump. Donald Trump talks about jobs. He talks about the unemployment rate is at a record low. He talks about restoring manufacturing jobs. So.
Yeah, and look, we've been restoring manufacturing jobs in our community too, but we're realistic about the fact that with automation, it's not going to look like the old economy. The president's promise is to turn back the clock, that we can somehow just go back to the 1950s, and it's just not true. The economy is changing, the pace of change is accelerating, and what we've got to do is master those changes in order to make them work for us. There are some very specific policy moves to do that, everything from making sure everybody has health care, to increasing the minimum wage, to delivering portable benefits so that when you get disrupted from your job, it's not such a disruption in the rest of your life. There are things that we can and must do to make sure that as these changes come, and again, they will with or without us, that we can actually succeed, especially in economically vulnerable communities like where I come from.
Okay, let's talk about your record, because you've been the mayor of South Bend since 2012. Let's put it up on the screen. More than $800 million in private investment, including a resurgence of downtown, more than 4,000 jobs created, more than 1,000 abandoned homes demolished or repaired in your first term. But critics point out the violent crime rate in South Bend went up till last year, and you have a continuing problem with homelessness. And I checked it out yesterday. The unemployment rate in South Bend is higher than the unemployment rate for the state of Indiana as a whole. So Pluses and minuses, yes?
It is true that I've not personally resolved the problem of violence nor the problem of homelessness, but I will say that we're doing more around homelessness than I think has happened in our community in 30 years, and I think that characterization of the violent crime rate isn't quite fair either. When I was a kid, it was not unusual to have more than 20 homicides in South Bend. Last year we had 9. That is obviously
I
not too
understand, but if
many.
you look at your term as mayor, it had gone up until last
It's not
year.
really true. It was up and down from year to year if you look at something like the homicide rate. I feel like I've been fighting gun violence and homicide in our community with one hand tied behind my back. But I am proud about everything we have done as a community to come together. By the way, a low-income community. You know, our per capita personal income just went over $20,000 a year. So, yeah, we have challenges with economic growth. We have challenges with crime. We have challenges with homelessness. But the way our community has risen to meet those challenges is something I'm very proud of.
Why are you in such a hurry? Why not wait a few years, get some more experience, build a bigger record, get better known, and run for president, say, at the ripe old age of 41?
It's not about becoming president. It's not about finding some
If you're running for president, it is about becoming president.
It's about America. It's about what America needs. All the decisions I've made to run for office in my career, and all the decisions I've made to not run for office, are about the moment, what is called for, and then what I bring to the table. I see this very unusual moment. Look, it's unusual for it to even be plausible that a 37-year-old Midwestern mayor is giving national interviews about a possible candidacy for president. But there's something happening right now that calls for something completely different than what we've been seeing. Generationally different, regionally different, somebody with a different life story and a different background. And to the surprise of many, including myself, this moment could be the only moment over the last 100 years or the next 100 years when it's appropriate for somebody like me to be in this conversation. But I'll tell you, with that moment shaping up, I'm not going to miss that moment.
Mayor, thank you. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll be watching out in the campaign trail.
Thank you.
Up next,